It was a warm spring afternoon in the small town of Maplewood, the kind of day where everyone seemed to be out enjoying the sunshine. Officer John Turner, a familiar face in the community, had just wrapped up a long shift patrolling the local school district. Known for his friendly demeanor and dedication to keeping the town safe, John was a beloved figure to many, though not without his critics. Wearing his crisp blue uniform and badge, John parked his cruiser on Main Street and walked into Mel's Diner, a staple in Maplewood for decades. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, signaling his arrival. Mel's Diner was the kind of place where the walls were adorned with pictures of the town's history, parades, festivals, and championship sports teams. The booths were lined with red vinyl, the countertops gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. It was the unofficial heart of the town, where families gathered after church and teenagers shared milkshakes after school. John had been coming here for years, often greeted warmly by the staff, many of whom knew him by name. But today was different. As John stepped up to the counter, ready to place his usual order of a turkey club sandwich with a side of fries, he noticed a palpable tension in the air. The chatter among the customers grew quieter, and the usual welcoming smiles from the staff were absent. Instead, the two servers behind the counter exchanged a look, a mix of disdain and hesitation, before one of them, a young man named Eric, stepped forward. "We're not serving you," Eric said flatly, crossing his arms over his chest. John blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "You heard me," Eric repeated, louder this time. "We don't serve cops here." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shocking not just John but the other customers as well. A few people glanced up from their meals, their forks hovering in midair, while others exchanged uneasy whispers. The hum of the diner seemed to fade into silence, broken only by the distant hiss of a coffee machine. John's initial reaction was disbelief. He had been coming to Mel's for years without incident. This was the place where he'd celebrated his promotion to sergeant and where he often stopped for a quick bite after long shifts. To be treated this way in a place he considered a second home felt like a punch to the gut. "Is this some kind of joke?" John asked, his voice steady but tinged with hurt. Eric shook his head. "No joke. We're done serving people like you. Go eat somewhere else." The other server, a woman named Beth, stood nearby, her arms full of plates. She shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, her eyes darting between Eric and John. It was clear she didn't entirely agree with Eric's stance, but she didn't step in to stop him either. John took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He wasn't the type to lose his temper, especially not in public. "Eric, I don't know what this is about, but I've been coming here for years. I've never had a problem before. Can we talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," Eric shot back. "You guys think you can walk around like you own the place, but not here. Not anymore." By now, the entire diner was watching. An older couple sitting by the window looked on with disapproval, while a group of teenagers in the corner pulled out their phones, possibly recording the exchange. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. John felt a mix of emotions, hurt, confusion, and a growing sense of unease. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also couldn't just walk away without addressing it. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "I don't know what's going on, but I'm here as a customer, just like anyone else. Whatever your issue is, let's handle it like adults." Eric smirked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Handle it like adults? That's rich coming from someone in your line of work." At this point, Beth finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Eric, maybe we should just let it go. He's not causing any trouble." But Eric wasn't backing down. "No, Beth. It's time someone stood up to people like him. They think they're above the law, but not here. Not on my watch." The comment hit John harder than he expected. He'd spent his entire career trying to be a force for good in the community, often going above and beyond to help those in need. Hearing his profession reduced to a stereotype felt deeply unfair. But instead of arguing, he took another deep breath and stepped back. "If that's how you feel," John said quietly, "I'll leave." As he turned to go, a voice called out from one of the booths. "This isn't right," said an older man with a weathered face and a cane leaning against his table. "The man's done nothing wrong. You can't treat people like this." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement and disagreement. Some customers sided with John, while others seemed to agree with Eric's sentiment, though they kept their opinions to themselves. It was clear that the incident had struck a nerve, touching on deeper issues that had been simmering beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic town. John walked out of the diner, the bell jingling behind him. As he reached his cruiser, he glanced back through the window. Eric was still at the counter, looking defiant, while Beth seemed torn, her face a mix of guilt and frustration. The older man with the cane shook his head in disapproval, while the teenagers in the corner excitedly reviewed whatever footage they had captured. As John started his car and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. He had always believed in the power of community and dialogue, but today, he'd been reminded of just how fragile those bonds could be. What he didn't know was that this seemingly small moment would soon spiral into something much bigger, drawing the entire town into a conflict that would force every word of what had happened at Mel's diner spread through Maplewood like wildfire. By the time Officer John Turner returned to the station, the incident was already the talk of the town. Social media posts began popping up, with videos from the teenagers in the corner showing snippets of the confrontation. The clip was short but damning. Eric's defiant words and John's calm response painted a picture that left the community divided. Some posts condemned the staff for their behavior, calling it disrespectful and unprofessional. Others sided with Eric, claiming it was a long overdue stand against systemic issues. Regardless of opinion, one thing was certain: everyone in Maplewood now had something to say. At the police station, John sat at his desk, replaying the event in his mind. He wasn't angry, at least, not in the way people might expect. What he felt was a deep, gnawing disappointment. Over the years, he had worked hard to be more than just a badge to the people of Maplewood. He was the officer who helped stranded drivers change their tires, who attended community events on his days off, and who checked on elderly residents during storms. He didn't expect special treatment, but outright hostility. That stung. Meanwhile, at the diner, the atmosphere was just as tense. Eric was still riding the high of his actions, convinced he had done the right thing. Someone had to say it, he told Beth as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. "Cops walk around here like they're untouchable." Not anymore. Beth wasn't so sure. She had known John for years, and while she didn't always agree with everything the police did, she couldn't reconcile the image of the kind and approachable officer with the accusations Eric was throwing around. "But why him?" she asked, her voice quiet. "John's never done anything to us. He's one of the good ones." "Good ones?" Eric scoffed. "They're all the same, Beth. Just because he's nice to your face doesn't mean he's not part of the problem." The owner of the diner, a no-nonsense woman named Melinda, overheard their conversation from the office. She stepped into the kitchen, her arms crossed. "Eric, you better hope this doesn't blow back on us. This place runs on its reputation, and alienating customers, especially someone as respected as John, is bad for business. One to confront their own biases, fears, and values." Eric rolled his eyes. "Let it blow back, Mel. If people don't like it, they can eat somewhere else. I'm not apologizing for standing up for what I believe in." But as the hours passed, Melinda started to realize the fallout might be worse than she'd anticipated. Regular customers began calling, some expressing outrage at how John had been treated, while others praised Eric for taking a stand. The division was sharp and immediate, and Melinda knew that if things escalated further, her diner could become the battleground for a conflict much larger than any of them. By the next morning, the situation had gone beyond Maplewood. The video had been shared thousands of times, catching the attention of local news outlets. Reporters began calling, asking for statements from both the police department and Mel's diner. The story was framed as part of a larger debate about the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve, with John and Eric unwittingly becoming symbols for opposing sides. John, however, had no interest in being part of a national narrative. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from friends, family, and colleagues, all asking how he was holding up. He answered politely but kept his responses short. What he wanted most was to get back to normal, but the more attention the story received, the less likely that seemed. At home that evening, John sat down with his wife, Karen, who had been following the situation closely. "You need to say something," she urged him. "The longer you stay quiet, the more people will fill in the blanks with their own versions of what happened." John shook his head. "I'm not looking to fan the flames, Karen. If I speak out, it'll just add fuel to the fire. People will either see me as a victim or a villain, and I don't want to be either." "But you're already in the middle of this," she countered. "You didn't ask for it, but it's happening. If you don't tell your side of the story, someone else will." Karen's words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. She was right, he was already a part of the story, whether he liked it or not. But what could he say that wouldn't make things worse? Back at the diner, Eric was doubling down on his position, giving an impromptu interview to a local reporter who had shown up unannounced. "I don't regret what I did," he said firmly. "People like John Turner represent a system that's failed a lot of us. Maybe he's a nice guy, but that doesn't erase the fact that he's part of the problem." Beth watched from the sidelines, her stomach churning. She hadn't agreed with Eric's actions, but she hadn't stopped him either, and now she felt complicit in something that was quickly spiraling out of control. After the reporter left, she approached Melinda, who was pacing behind the counter. "We need to fix this," Beth said. One of those shifts brought him to a neighborhood on the outskirts of town. While responding to a routine call about a noise complaint, John encountered Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who had lived in Maplewood her entire life. She didn't know about the incident at the diner, she wasn't one to use social media, and she greeted John with her usual warm smile. "Oh, Officer Turner, I'm so glad it's you," she said, wringing her hands. "It's those boys down the street with their loud music again. I don't want to cause trouble, but it's getting harder to sleep these days." John assured her he'd take care of it and spent a few minutes talking with her about her garden and her plans for her grandson's upcoming visit. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved his job. For every confrontation or controversy, there were countless quiet acts of service that didn't make the news but mattered deeply to the people involved. Meanwhile, at Mel's diner, things were far less peaceful. Business had taken a hit since the incident, with some regulars refusing to return and others coming in only to voice their opinions, often loudly, to anyone who would listen. Melinda, the owner, was at her wits' end. "Eric, you've got to do something," she said one morning as she counted out the register. "An apology, a statement, something. This can't go on." Eric leaned against the counter, unbothered. "Apologize? For what?" "I'm not sorry, Mel. And honestly, the people who are mad about this can go somewhere else. We don't need them." "Maybe you don't, but this diner does," Melinda shot back. "You're not the one paying the bills." Beth, who had been quietly wiping down tables, finally spoke up. "Eric, you're not seeing the bigger picture. This isn't just about you or John. It's about all of us. The diner, the town, everything's connected. And right now, you're tearing it apart." Eric frowned but didn't respond. For the first time, Beth's words seemed to give him pause. He prided himself on standing by his convictions, but even he couldn't ignore the damage that was piling up around them. Later that evening, Melinda decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to John, calling his station and leaving a message. "This is Melinda from the diner," her voicemail began. "I think we need to talk." John received the message at the end of his shift. He debated whether to respond. Part of him wanted to leave the whole ordeal behind, but another part, one driven by his sense of duty, felt compelled to hear her out. After a long pause, he called her back. When they met the next morning, the atmosphere was tense. They sat across from each other at a small table in the back of the diner, away from the curious eyes of the remaining customers. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Melinda began. "What happened here shouldn't have happened. You didn't deserve that." John leaned back in his chair, studying her. "So why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do?" "I don't know," Melinda said honestly. "I just thought, maybe if we talked, we could figure something out. You're a reasonable man, John. Maybe you could talk to him." John considered her request. The idea of confronting Eric didn't sit well with him. He didn't want to escalate things further. But he also knew that avoiding the issue wouldn't solve anything. "I'll think about it," he said finally. As John left the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. The town's wounds were too deep, its divisions too sharp, to be healed with a simple conversation. But he also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. That night, as he sat at home, John found himself scrolling through the comments on the video of the incident. They ranged from supportive to scathing, with every possible opinion in between. One comment, however, stood out to him. "It's easy to pick sides, but hard to fix what's broken. Maybe it's time to start listening instead of shouting." John stared at the words, their simplicity striking a chord. Maybe the commenter was right. Maybe what Maplewood needed wasn't more arguments or grand gestures, but a willingness to listen, to truly hear each other, even when it was uncomfortable. The next day, John made a decision. He reached out to a local community leader, Pastor Davis, who was known for his ability to bring people together in times of crisis. "I think we need a town meeting," John told him. "Not to argue, but to talk. To listen." Pastor Davis agreed, and within days, plans were underway for a community forum at the church. Flyers were distributed, social media posts went up, and word spread quickly. The event promised to be a chance for everyone, John, Eric, and the rest of the town, to come together and address the issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. As the date approached, the tension in Maplewood reached a fever pitch. People speculated about what would happen, whether it would bring healing or drive the town further apart. John, for his part, remained focused on one goal: finding a way to move forward. He knew it wouldn't be easy. But as he stood in the church that evening, looking out at the growing crowd, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward something better. The night of the town meeting arrived, and Maplewood buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. People filled the church's modest sanctuary, spilling into the aisles and even outside the doors, where a speaker system had been set up for the overflow. The crowd was a mix of young and old, longtime residents and newcomers, all curious about how this gathering would unfold. Conversations buzzed in low murmurs, laced with tension, hope, and skepticism. At the front of the room stood Pastor Davis, a tall man with a warm but commanding presence. He welcomed everyone with a steady voice, thanking them for coming and acknowledging the complicated emotions that had brought them together. "We're not here tonight to pick sides," he said firmly. "We're here to listen. To understand. And hopefully, to find a way forward." Officer John Turner sat in the front row, his uniform crisp, his face calm but unreadable. He had wrestled with whether to attend in uniform or civilian clothes but ultimately decided the badge was part of who he was, both the good and the bad that came with it. Beside him sat Karen, her hand resting on his for support. Across the room, Eric slouched against the wall near the back, arms crossed and jaw tight. He hadn't planned to attend, but the curiosity, and pressure from Melinda and Beth, had been too strong to resist. He didn't see himself as part of the problem. If anything, he saw this as an opportunity to make his case to the town. The meeting began with a moment of silence, followed by Pastor Davis inviting John to speak first. The room fell silent as John rose, his tall frame seeming even more imposing in the quiet space. He walked to the podium, scanning the crowd, and then began to speak. "I want to start by saying thank you to everyone who showed up tonight," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know it's not easy to face situations like this head-on, but the fact that you're all here means that we care about this town and the people in it. And that's what matters most." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "What happened at the diner last week hurt me deeply, not because of personal pride, but because it made me question everything I've worked for as a police officer in this town. I became a cop because I wanted to serve this community, to protect it, to make it better. And for most of my career, I thought I was doing that. But this incident showed me that there's a gap between how I see myself and how others might see me. And that's something I need to understand." The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. John took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm not here to defend myself or the actions of every officer out there. I know our profession has its flaws, deep ones. But I'm also not here to be a symbol of something I don't represent. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to find a way to bridge this gap. Because this town is worth it. You're worth it." When John finished, the room broke into light applause, tentative but sincere. He returned to his seat, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Next, Pastor Davis invited Eric to speak. The young man hesitated for a moment before pushing off the wall and walking to the front. His posture was defensive, his expression guarded, but his voice was steady as he began. "I didn't plan to make a big scene that day," he started, his eyes scanning the room. "But when I saw Officer Turner walk into the diner, something in me snapped. I thought about all the times I've seen people like me treated unfairly, all the stories I've heard, all the things I've felt but couldn't say. And I thought, not today. Not here. So, I spoke up. Maybe I didn't do it the right way, but I did it." Eric glanced at John, his expression softening slightly. "I don't know you personally, Officer Turner. But you represent something bigger than just yourself. And sometimes, that's hard for people like me to separate. It's not about you, but it is about what you stand for. I know that might not be fair, but it's the truth." The room was silent, hanging on his words. Eric shifted, his voice growing softer. "I'm not saying I was right. But I'm not saying I was wrong, either. I wanted to be heard. To matter." He looked back at the crowd, his voice steadying again. "This isn't just about me and John. It's about all of us. How we treat each other, how we see each other, and how we move forward. That's why I'm here. Because I care about this town too." As Eric stepped back, the room erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. It was clear that his words had struck a chord, even with those who disagreed with his actions. What followed was a powerful and emotional discussion. Pastor Davis facilitated, ensuring everyone had a chance to speak while maintaining a respectful atmosphere. Residents shared their stories, some praising John's years of service, others expressing frustration with systemic issues that went beyond one man or one town. Beth finally spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was there that day. I didn't agree with what Eric did, but I didn't stop it either. And that's on me. I think a lot of us feel stuck, caught between wanting to stand up for what's right and not knowing how to do it without hurting each other. But we can do better. We have to do better." The discussion continued late into the night, touching on issues of respect, accountability, and the shared responsibility of building a stronger community. By the end, there were no clear answers, but there was something just as important: understanding. As the crowd began to disperse, John and Eric found themselves face to face near the door. For a moment, neither spoke. Then John extended his hand. "I appreciate you coming tonight," he said simply. Eric hesitated, then shook his hand. "I appreciate you listening," he replied. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything that had been said, and left unsaid, throughout the evening. As John walked out into the cool night air, he felt a cautious sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, it felt possible. And for Maplewood, that was a start. The morning after the town meeting, a strange calm settled over Maplewood, like the collective exhale of a town that had held its breath for too long. Conversations at the local coffee shop had shifted from heated debates to quieter, more introspective discussions. People who had barely acknowledged each other on the street were now stopping to exchange a few words, cautiously bridging the divides that had formed in recent weeks. John Turner was up early, as usual, sitting at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. He hadn't been able to sleep much, replaying the events of the night before in his mind. While the meeting hadn't resolved everything, it had been a start. For the first time in days, he felt like he could look people in the eye without the weight of unspoken accusations hanging between them. At the station, John's colleagues greeted him with quiet nods and small smiles. His fellow officers had been following the controversy from the sidelines, unsure of how to support him without making things worse. Now, the tension in the precinct felt lighter. Even Officer Daniels, who was known for his gruff demeanor, stopped by John's desk to clap him on the shoulder. "Good job last night," Daniels said simply, his tone gruff but genuine. John nodded, a flicker of gratitude passing over his face. "Thanks, Daniels. Means a lot." Across town, at Mel's Diner, the morning rush was surprisingly busy. Melinda, who had been dreading another slow day, looked around at the bustling tables with cautious optimism. Customers chatted over their coffee and pancakes, some even discussing the meeting from the night before. Beth moved through the diner with a sense of purpose, her usual quiet demeanor replaced with a newfound confidence. She had spoken up at the meeting, and while it had been terrifying, it had also been liberating. For the first time, she felt like she had a voice, not just as a waitress at Mel's, but as a member of the community. Eric, however, was notably absent. He hadn't returned to work that morning, and Melinda was too drained to push the issue. She hoped he was taking some time to reflect on everything that had happened. Eric wasn't at home, though. He was sitting by the river that ran just outside of town, the same spot he had gone to as a kid whenever he needed to think. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on him, forcing him to confront not only the impact of his actions but also the reasons behind them. He thought about his family, his dad, who had been pulled over more times than he could count for no apparent reason, his brother, who had been arrested for something he didn't do but couldn't afford to fight in court. Those memories were what had fueled his anger when he saw John walk into the diner that day. But now, sitting by the water, Eric realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit: John wasn't the problem. The problem was bigger, more complicated than one man in a uniform. And if he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to find a way to address those larger issues without tearing down the people who were trying to help. Eric pulled out his phone and opened a blank note, jotting down the first thoughts that came to mind. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had direction. Back at the diner, Beth noticed an unfamiliar figure walk in, a reporter from the local news station. He approached the counter with a friendly smile and introduced himself to Melinda. "I've been following the story about what happened here," he said, glancing around the diner. "I was at the town meeting last night, and I'd like to do a piece on the aftermath. It seems like this town is trying to heal, and I think that's a story worth telling." Melinda hesitated, unsure if she wanted more attention brought to the diner. But before she could respond, Beth stepped forward. "I think it's a good idea," Beth said, her voice steady. "But if you're going to tell the story, you need to tell all of it, not just what happened here, but why it happened and what we're doing to move forward." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. "That's exactly what I was hoping to do." Over the next few days, the reporter interviewed various people in town, including John, Melinda, and even Pastor Davis. Eric, surprisingly, agreed to speak as well, though he insisted on keeping it short. "I'm not proud of what I did," he told the reporter. "But I'm not ashamed, either. It needed to happen, not the way it did, maybe, but the conversation needed to start. And now it's up to all of us to keep it going." When the story aired, it painted a picture of a town in transition, one that had faced a difficult moment and was working to come out stronger on the other side. The piece struck a chord with viewers, not just in Maplewood but in surrounding towns as well. People started reaching out to Pastor Davis, asking how they could organize similar forums in their own communities. Eric's words, in particular, resonated with many. A local activist group reached out to him, inviting him to join their efforts to address systemic issues in a more constructive way. At first, he was hesitant, unsure if he was ready to take on that kind of responsibility. But after a long conversation with Beth, who had become an unexpected confidant, he decided to give it a shot. For John, life slowly returned to normal, though he knew things would never be quite the same. He had learned a lot about himself and his role in the community, and he was determined to use that knowledge to be a better officer, and a better neighbor. He started attending the forums regularly, not as a speaker but as a participant, listening to the concerns of the people he served and finding ways to address them. Months later, the town felt different. The wounds from the diner incident hadn't entirely healed, but they had begun to scar over, leaving behind lessons that couldn't be ignored. People talked more openly now, not just about the incident but about the larger issues it had brought to light. The diner, once a symbol of division, had become a gathering place again, a spot where people from all walks of life came together, not always agreeing but always willing to listen. And in the evenings, when the rush had died down, you could often find John and Eric sitting at the counter, sharing a cup of coffee and a conversation. It wasn't perfect. But it was a start. Months turned into a year, and Maplewood continued its journey toward healing and growth. The town wasn't perfect, far from it, but the scars from the diner incident had become reminders of resilience and progress. The incident had spurred changes that no one had anticipated, changes that touched every corner of the community. John Turner, once a polarizing figure in the town, had become a trusted face beyond his role as a police officer. He spearheaded several initiatives to foster stronger connections between law enforcement and the community. One of the most impactful programs was Coffee and Conversations, held every Saturday morning at Mel's Diner. It was an informal gathering where officers and residents could sit together, talk openly, and bridge the gaps of misunderstanding. The first few meetings had been tense, with guarded exchanges and pointed questions, but over time, the atmosphere shifted. People began to see the officers as individuals with families, dreams, and struggles, not just as badges. John himself became an advocate for change within the department. He worked with local leaders to implement more community-oriented policing strategies, prioritizing dialogue and trust over authority. He also pushed for training programs that addressed implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the shift was palpable. Officers who had initially resisted the changes eventually came to see the value in building relationships rather than just enforcing rules. Eric's transformation was just as significant, if not more so. Joining the activist group had been a leap of faith, but it turned out to be the turning point he didn't know he needed. The group focused on addressing systemic issues, from advocating for fair housing policies to creating mentorship programs for young people in the town. Eric threw himself into the work, finding purpose in action. He quickly became a leading voice, not just for the group but for the broader community. Through his activism, Eric learned the power of collaboration. He began working closely with John and other officers, organizing workshops and town hall meetings that brought together residents and law enforcement to discuss tough issues. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of what Maplewood could achieve when people set aside their differences to work toward a common goal. The diner itself underwent a transformation as well. Melinda, inspired by everything that had happened, decided to rebrand the diner as a place of unity and dialogue. She renamed it the Common Ground Café and redecorated it with photos and memorabilia from Maplewood's history. The walls were filled with snapshots of community events, candid moments of connection, and even a framed article about the infamous diner incident and the town meeting that followed. Beth, who had once been content to blend into the background, had blossomed into a leader in her own right. She became the café's unofficial ambassador, organizing events like storytelling nights and charity fundraisers. She even took up writing, penning a series of essays about her experiences during the diner incident and its aftermath. Her pieces were published in the local paper and resonated deeply with readers, offering a window into the human side of conflict and reconciliation. One of the café's most successful events was the Shared Stories series, where residents took turns sharing personal stories about their lives and struggles. These events became a cornerstone of the community, creating a space for empathy and understanding. One particularly memorable evening featured both John and Eric sharing their perspectives on the diner incident. Their candidness moved everyone in attendance, with some people admitting they had never fully considered what the other side might feel. Outside of these public efforts, smaller, quieter changes were happening too. People who had once been strangers, or even adversaries, were now finding ways to connect. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings were now inviting each other over for coffee or helping out with yard work. The high school, once a microcosm of the town's divisions, saw students organizing their own forums and projects to foster inclusivity and respect. The ripple effects of the town's efforts even reached beyond Maplewood. Other towns in the region began taking notice, reaching out to learn how Maplewood had managed to turn such a divisive moment into an opportunity for growth. Pastor Davis, who had facilitated the original town meeting, found himself invited to speak at events across the state, sharing lessons from Maplewood's journey. He always emphasized that the process wasn't easy or quick, but it was worth every step. Despite all the progress, there were still challenges. Not everyone in town embraced the changes, and there were occasional setbacks. Some residents remained skeptical of the new initiatives, and old wounds sometimes resurfaced. But those moments of resistance were met with patience and perseverance. The people of Maplewood had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about moving forward with the wisdom it had given them. 1 year after the incident, the town held a commemorative event at the Common Ground Café. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense but a reflection on how far they had come and how far they still had to go. John and Eric stood side by side, addressing the crowd together. "This past year has taught me something I never fully understood," John said, his voice steady but emotional. "Real change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from us, from people willing to have the hard conversations, to admit when we're wrong, and to keep showing up even when it's uncomfortable." Eric nodded, stepping up to the microphone. "A year ago, I let my anger get the better of me. But that anger came from a place of wanting something better, not just for me, but for all of us. And what I've learned is that we don't get better by tearing each other down. We get better by building something together." The crowd erupted into applause, not just for the words but for the journey they represented. As the event wound down and people began to mingle, John and Eric found themselves once again at the counter, sharing a cup of coffee. They didn't need to say much. The comfortable silence between them said it all. Maplewood wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was stronger, kinder, and more connected than it had been before. And for a small town that had faced its share of trials, that was more than enough.